Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. Today's Tuesday, July 28th, 2020. And tonight's topic is trauma responses and staying calm. This is another, in fact, I'm going through a series of broadcasts where I'm really responding to parents' requests. And so I think this is one of those ones that we can't hear it too much. We can be reminded of it and bringing our trauma responses, our then our trauma and how to remain calm to our awareness is a part of the equation, a part of the healing, a part of skill development in this area. So like a lot of my broadcasts, like most of my broadcasts, I think you'll find this one more broadly applicable than people might imagine. I think when we think of trauma, we think of what therapists, clinicians call big T trauma, capital T trauma. But when we think about trauma in therapy, when we think about our trauma responses, we're really talking about the entire spectrum, the entire continuum of trauma and trauma responses. And like a lot of things in our culture, and I talked about this on one of our broadcasts specifically recently, I think there is this desire to put everything in two piles. That you either have trauma or you don't, and that you either have a trauma response or you don't. And we don't like to understand things as a continuum. There's something about that doesn't feel like it gives us a sense of control over things. So tonight, like always, I'm going to be talking about the continuum rather than talking about the idea of these two piles, this kind of black or white kind of thinking, kind of mentality, this borderline kind of thinking that I referred to earlier. Let's talk about what trauma is. And I've already gotten into it a little bit by talking about big T versus little t and also talking about the continuum. Trauma is an individual experience or an event with a condition that is perceived as threatening. There's a loss of safety and control. This first bullet point, I think there's something really deep and meaningful in it because it speaks to a treatment approach that's very important. Because when you're trying to, even as a parent, when you're trying to help a child move forward or help a client heal, you can take over. You can remove their control. I've made this mistake dozens of times in my clinical career and dozens, hundreds of times in my parenting role, because I frame it as I'm doing it for their best interest. I'm doing it for their own good. But when somebody's dealing with trauma, when somebody's dealing with the wound, to kind of bypass the resistance, to bypass the defense, even under the guise or the idea of I'm doing it to help you, is to re-traumatize somebody. Because an element in trauma is the loss of control. And that is why we learn to hold people, psychologically speaking, to hold them lightly. The way that I've been trained to think of it is to give the client or the child their dignity. We allow our information and our insight and our awareness to inform us in our response, but that doesn't mean we rip off the proverbial armor from our client or our child. And I think that's hard for parents because we want to, as parents especially, we want to justify our boundary, our response. And so we want to come to some kind of agreement or consensus with the child on what the issue at hand is. And unless we tear off the armor, the defenses that they've put up to look at the wound that is there, we find it difficult to maintain a boundary. That's a very lonely place to be, to maintain a boundary in the absence of consensus and acknowledgement. Trauma is an incident or event that overwhelms the person's previous or present coping, right? It starts to get to a point where we're lacking the ability to respond calmly, to respond patiently, to respond in a way that we're really having access to the higher level thinking, the highest level thinking that we have access to, where we're really responding from the fight or flight, which oftentimes can be irrational and knee-jerk and really offline, unconscious response. You don't think about, if you see a rattlesnake on the ground, you don't think about jumping away from the rattlesnake. That's why if you see a toy rattlesnake or even something out of the corner of your eye that looks like or sounds like a rattlesnake, you're going to have that jump back instinct, because it's not safe to think through it. If we had to think through of getting out of the way of an oncoming car, we would end up in danger. So that's the part of our brain that causes us to react. And so trauma is an incident which triggers our fight or flight, that causes or presents a threat and gives us a lack of safety. And it can, depending on the severity or the chronicity of it, it can start to rewire the brain. Think of walking across a large meadow with grass, with wild grass growing in it. And if you walk along a certain line in the meadow, after a while, that path is going to become clear. And you're going to walk up to a meadow where there's a path, and you're going to be more inclined to walk in the previously established path. That's like our brain. It becomes wired to respond in certain ways. We see it as, at times, our fight or flight part of our brain, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later, more specifically and scientifically. We think of it as hijacking the rest of the brain. If a soldier is exposed to gunfire, which is a real threat, and then there's a firework, a firecracker, a car backfiring, you would see the trauma response of a soldier hitting the ground, pulling everybody down with him or with her. That would be the example of a trauma response. The threat isn't there anymore, but the brain has become wired to respond in that way. And in much more subtle ways that I'll be describing tonight, we can do that with our children. Attempts at coping may become limited to limbic, like I've been describing, the limbic system, or survival options such as avoidance, isolation, dependency, self-medicating, reenactment, self-harming, or dissociation. I've already talked about big T and small t. For the sake of being in relationship to a child, to a parent, to a person, really, I don't find it important to make a distinction between the two. And frankly, I don't get to decide if it's big or small. The person who gets to decide the trauma is the person who's reporting it. We've heard a lot of that in our social justice and our education around racism and our culture lately, that, listen to the people who have been subjected to racism and believe what they're saying. That's some of the instruction that we're getting. The same is true of children or other people. But for some reason, probably to maintain a sense of control over situations, we feel the need to weigh in on whether or not something is traumatic or whether or not it fits under the umbrella of big or small t. I love this definition because it again, it removes the argument, the debate. It takes it to its core element. Somebody defined this trauma in this way to me, and it's always been meaningful. And they simply said it's anything less than ideal, anything less than optimal. And if we can allow ourselves to think of trauma in that way, then we stop worrying about the judgment. We take ego out of it. We let people have their reactions. And since we're learning in this work that we do together at Evoke, since we're learning that our boundaries don't need to be dependent on being right, we have less of a need to argue about who's right and who's wrong. We just get to set our boundaries as they are. The exposure, like I said, the chronicity, the amount of time over time that it happens in our lives, or the severity, can definitely have an impact on our lives. It's going to have a different impact on the brain. There's research out there that shows that some people, for example, that experience, this is interesting, that have experienced PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder, kind of a delayed, lasting trauma response, that people have experienced that have also been in families where there was not a lot of containment, where there was a lot of anxiety, where there was less of a healthy attachment. Whereas families where there was more attunement, more of a secure attachment, less anxiety, then someone's less likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So we'll talk tonight about resiliency factors. And I think that's probably one of the most popular questions that I get asked these days by parents is, what can I do to mitigate my child's exposure and internalization of trauma? Where it happens in our life can have an effect, right? What stage we're at. Developmental psychologists look at human beings as moving through stages. And at various stages, there are different tasks that we're grappling with. A very simple and very common one is during adolescence, which is a little bit longer than you and I might think of adolescence. It goes until the early 20s. That during this period where the adolescent brain is developing, that the adolescent is working toward developing who they are, a sense of identity. And stage-like progression is affected by various traumas, right? If your development is arrested at a certain stage, you're more likely to have issues in that area. Young children, 0 to 1, are working on trust. Is the world a safe place? If you have trauma during the first year or two of life, you can develop just this innate sense that the world is not a safe place, not to be trusted. It might not be conscious. In fact, it most likely won't be conscious unless that pattern of behavior continues, but that's going to arrest. You're going to become fixated at an unresolved stage. That's why the first 5 years are so important in life, because the world is so small, 0 to 5. At 20 or 30 or 40, the world is very, very big with lots of interactions, lots of relationships, lots of opportunities, and it's difficult to kind of manage or get a hold on the entire world when it becomes that large. But when it's about changing diapers, when it's about responding to a baby's cry, you're more likely to be successful in responding to a child's need at that stage. So stage of life when the trauma occurs. And then resiliency factors, which to me is the most fascinating thing. We'll talk about that tonight, this evening. So let's talk about a little bit about brain science. We'll talk about the prefrontal cortex, or the top part of the brain, the last part of the brain to develop, the part of the brain that develops. We think we know it comes in around 22 to 26, give or take. Average it around 25. A little bit earlier for female brains, a little bit later for male brains. And at that point, we have essentially all parts of our brain. The prefrontal cortex is that part of our brain, that top and front part that is good for reasoning, is good for problem solving and finding solutions, weighing out options, developing compassion and empathy for other people, practicing delay of gratification, frustration tolerance, restraint. It's the most mature part of the brain, if you will. When we are stressed out or exposed to trauma, there is a spike in dopamine. Excuse me, a spike in cortisol. We have released in our body cortisol or adrenaline, and this allows us to fight or flight, right? Dopamine is reduced. We have a sense of unwellness. Dopamine is a chemical in our brain that's associated with getting high or feeling good, right? That's what drugs do, is they release dopamine into our brain and we feel okay, we feel good, we feel well. So there's a drop in dopamine, there's a spike in cortisol or adrenaline, and we're able to respond to the stressor. This allows us to survive. It's part of what makes us capable of avoiding catastrophic events, getting bit by the rattlesnake, running away, getting out of the way of a speeding car. These are not conscious responses. This is part of the sympathetic nervous system response that we don't have to think about, just happens to us automatically. When there's a perceived threat, there is external information and an internal translation or a reading of that gives us a sense of, is this a situation that is safe? Is this a situation that's a threat? And our amygdala determines that. Our amygdala determines that response. So that gives you a little idea about the brain. And that will come into play as we go on. When we think about keeping calm, psychologists or neuropsychologists will talk about the high road versus the low road. The high road is when we have online our higher level thinking. We have a form of processing information that involves higher rational reflective thought processes in our brain. High road processing allows for mindfulness. This is the most important phrase: flexibility of responses. Response flexibility is essentially the technical term for remaining calm. We're able to weigh our options and make a reasonable, rational decision. And that can come from awareness, that can come from practice, that can come from creating experiences or living in experiences where we feel safe. Some of those resiliency factors that I'm going to talk about, right? The brain starts to wire as kind of an anxious brain versus a non-anxious brain. Daniel Siegel talks about flipping your lid, right? When we're triggered by a trauma response, he uses the hand as the model. The prefrontal cortex, the high parts of the brain, go offline, and we're being run by this primitive part in the middle and the lower part, this fight or flight part. So the high road in responding to stressors in our life is the prefrontal cortex and its processes. The low road of processing that they describe involves the shutting down of the higher processes of the mind and leaves the individual in a state of intense emotions, impulsive reactions, rigid and repetitive responses. And it lacks self-reflection. It lacks self-reflection and the consideration of another point of view. I mean, what I love about what we know about brain science now is it takes the judgment out of it. This is how the brain works. And if we had an infinite knowledge of the brain, we would be able to see people's mental health and illness and their histories and how that contributed to it. We'd be able to see, of course, there's always predetermined factors that come from our genetics, right? There's a predisposition to certain behaviors and responses, right? There's the given, if you will, in the human being. But we'd be able to see all of this stuff. This is the way that a traumatized brain is going to be wired. It's going to be irrational. It's going to be impulsive. It's going to cut off its nose to spite its face, so to speak. Because the situation is so threatening that the behavior is going to look irrational because the child or the person is meeting some other need that is a greater threat. The involvement in the prefrontal cortex when we are triggered, when we're having a trauma response, is offline. These intense emotions can lead you to have knee-jerk reactions instead of thoughtful responses. When you're feeling stressed or find yourself in situations where you're with your child that trigger your past unresolved issues, your mind may shut off and become inflexible. Here's a slogan from Al-Anon that I've used before, but I'm going to insert here and talk about later. It's the idea that there's no real such thing as an overreaction or being too sensitive. In Al-Anon, the way that they say that is, if it's hysterical, it's historical. If you're having a response to a trigger, your child comes home high, you get a phone call from the principal, you get a phone call late at night while your child is out, pick the stimulus, and your reaction is disproportionately large compared to what the situation would dictate, you're responding to something historical. You're responding or tuning into a certain kind of wiring in your brain that says this is a real big threat. Phone calls, the last time I got a phone call, or when my mother died, or when, you know, the news, the bad news I got happened at 10 o'clock at night. So the phone ringing at 10 o'clock at night is going to remind me of that. My brother was an addict, for example, hypothetically. My brother who's an addict or an alcohol who died of the disease. So my son or daughter comes home high in the 10th grade, and I'm going to connect it to that trauma. So I'm not dealing with a child who's smoking marijuana. I'm dealing with the death of my brother. So it's not really accurate to say I'm overreacting. It's that in a way, I'm reacting to the wrong thing. I'm reacting to something that isn't there, that is historical. And the response becomes inflexible. That's an important part. It's rigid. It's old. No parents really feel good about themselves or what they may have done to their children in this low road state of mind. None of us feel good about this. These are the examples of behavior where we go back and we apologize and we say our sorry. We could sometimes, during some moments, we can even recognize it while it's happening. We can observe it almost. But the thing about it is that because our prefrontal cortex is offline, we're incapable of taking that detour. Somebody ask this question. So if the prefrontal cortex is not developed until 25, then how do boys and girls get on the high road? Again, it's not that they have no higher level thinking, it's that they don't have all of it. We think of the prefrontal cortex coming in full at around 25. But it doesn't mean that there's no higher level thinking. That's the basic idea. Again, not a black and white. I may have told you the story before. Years ago, now he's 18-year-old son, he was probably in 6th grade at the time, and he said to my now 27-year-old son, who was in high school at the time, my younger son said to my older son, I know why you're mean to me sometimes. And my older son said, why is that? And my younger son said, because your brain isn't all the way grown in. And I thought that was really high level thinking for a 6th grader. And then my older son, of course, responded back and said, well, neither is yours either, which was also a good point. So it's not about black and white. It's about continuum and development. Mindsight is kind of the ability to objectively look at a situation, to be able to see both perspectives, to kind of have that 10,000-foot view. This is an idea that Daniel Siegel talks a lot about in his books. It's an ability to see what other people think and feel. It's a precursor or essential in intimacy. We lose our mindsight in a trauma response, right? You know this. You know in your trauma responses, your anxious responses, your fight or flight, that you lose the perspective of the other person. We all know what that feels like. Mindsight is the ability to perceive the internal experience of another person and make sense of that imagined experience, enabling us to offer compassionate responses that reflect our understanding and concern. Mindsight is one of the outcomes of therapy. Part of what I use in my therapy is mindsight, which has come from my own therapy. I was just thinking about it today. I was thinking about it with a client where they were saying something and I was able to imagine 2 or 3 motives for his behavior. And they were simply based on my own awareness, my own development of myself, kind of unpacking myself. Because I know me, I know you. In the 9 Rusty Armor, the wizard Merlin answers a question before the knight, in this allegory, before the knight asks it. And the knight says, can you read minds? And the wizard Merlin says, no, I can't read minds, but because I know myself, I know you. And that's what awareness does. That's what our work does. As we unpack and sort through our trauma, as we develop awareness, as we understand the lessons, the messages, as we get out of our family of origin context enough to be able to see it as what it is, which is just a construct, just a construction. It's not the truth. It's just what our family was. We can start to then make choices about it. If I don't do my work, if I was beat by my father physically, and I don't do my work, then it's very likely that I'm not going to trust men or people that touch me on the shoulder. I might jerk in fear. But if I do a great deal of work around it, I will come. Not just because I've been told, because you can be told and it makes no difference. I'll come to experience that not every man is a threat physically if he touches me. That everybody that taps me on the shoulder isn't going to hurt me. It speaks to the heart of self-compassion. Self-compassion is an essential element in us looking at our stuff. If we have judgment toward ourselves, impatient toward ourselves, we're not going to be able to unpack our trauma. And we're going to be very unknowing with our children. I talk about this. I didn't write this tonight, but I thought about writing it. This idea that it's okay to not understand your children. But that's your job, right? Your job is to understand them. And to understand them, you have to develop this mindset. You have to develop this awareness. You have to look at yourself. You have to see yourself and everybody in your family of origin from the outside. And the way that you do that is you sit in a therapist's office and they are fundamentally different than your parents. That's the moment that you look back and you think, it's what I've talked about in my own work, is I sat with Jamie Gill for 21 years. And at some point I started to think, I've never been in a room like this before. I thought everybody was the way that we were. I knew some of the things that went on and weren't normal or typical, but essentially, I thought everybody was that way. It's the same thing that happens when I talk to the young men in our program. I work with young men. It can be the young women also. When I talk to the young men about their shame and their guilt, and I say, it doesn't matter to me whether or not my child gets into Harvard or not. At least that's what I aspire to. If they get in, the idea is, the goal is, congratulations for you. But it doesn't matter to me one way or the other. That's the goal. That's the ideal. And the young men look at me and they say, nobody thinks that way. And that's really what they believe. They have no experience with somebody seeing them, understanding them. So response flexibility, like I said, is the technical term for remaining calm. It's being intentional versus being primitive, kind of our unfiltered responses. Sometimes I've talked about the model that we use at Evoke as intentional parenting. In fact, I think I bought the domain at one point. It probably lapsed, but I think I bought the domain at one point of intentionalparenting.com. I think somebody that I admire uses the phrase, the awakened parent, right? It's this idea of consciousness, of bringing into consciousness all of those traumas, all of those messages, all of those wounds, and sorting them out so that we can respond from an intentional, choiceful place. Being able to respond in flexible ways is one of the biggest challenges of being a parent. Response flexibility is the ability of the mind to sort through a wide variety of mental processes, such as impulses, ideas, and feelings, and come up with a thoughtful, non-automatic response. I've shared with you all that if you walk up to a person, think of a child walking up to a parent, and you share something with them, and the response is to gasp with something like, one thing about that person in that situation, that's they're not safe. They're not capable of taking care of you. And what's more insidious about that is oftentimes people equate that with love, and it's not love. It's anxiety and it's fear. It's not bad. No more than a broken knee is bad. It's just broken. It's just not working. And what's needed in the moment. So these non-automatic responses, it's really healing. And that's why it doesn't matter if you have loads of very clear big T trauma. In fact, sometimes I think the people with big T trauma have an advantage over the little t trauma people because it's obvious that things went wrong. But a large percentage of the population have that little t trauma. So they think it's normal. They have the fantasy, the illusion that they grew up in a normal family. But since there's no such thing, and since we have therapy, we kind of figure this out. And we learn to respond to our children as people. Response flexibility is the opposite of a knee-jerk reaction. It involves the capacity to delay gratification and to inhibit impulsive behaviors. This ability is the cornerstone of emotional maturity and compassionate relationships. And it should be said that our children are fantastic. They're sources of trauma, right? They get themselves into dangerous situations. Part of it triggers our own anxiety and trauma that's unresolved from childhood, but part of it is in and of itself traumatic. It's new trauma. All trauma doesn't happen in childhood. And if you're a parent, you know that that's true. So think about a trauma response. A trauma response, don't think about it too technically. A trauma response is an inflexible, rigid, and repetitive response. It's highly emotional. Like I said, if it's hysterical, it's historical. It's reactive or knee-jerk. It will look disproportionate to the situation. I use the example, I don't even know if cars backfire anymore. I haven't heard a car backfire in decades. But when I was a kid, maybe it speaks to my socioeconomic level growing up. There was backfiring cars, but the car backfiring or the firework going off. It's not curious or patient. Essentially, a trauma response prevents the ability to hold space for the other person in a compassionate, safe, non-judgmental way. You lose the ability to parent in that moment, or to friend in that moment, or to therapist in that moment, right? You lose the capacity in that moment. And it doesn't have to be big. So what does trauma do? Like I said, it releases cortisol, and low, moderate levels of cortisol or stress in our body have a tremendously negative impact on many of the body's systems. The immune system is affected. Stress is an enormous drain on the immune system. We age quicker. Telomeres are the ends of our genetic coding, right? Think of like the shoelaces. And as we get older, our genes kind of get shorter. That's why they can tell, generally speaking, the age of somebody by looking at their DNA. But stress will age you. There's jokes about people getting gray hair. The reality is that it happens. You age with stress. Heart disease, cancer, autoimmune diseases, all of these are affected by big T and little t trauma. Maybe even more so little t trauma because it's chronic over time. They have huge correlations with trauma and addiction, with mental health and addiction issues. It's amazing to me. And some of you are therapists, I know, and this is the most amazing thing to me. But when I graduated from graduate school, I was pretty clear that mental health issues and addiction was rooted in woundedness and trauma. And in fact, some of the addiction folks kind of challenged that notion early in my career, saying, no, it's a disease that's in the person. And I was kind of taught that that's the way that I should think about it, and that I should think of things more weighted in the genetic area in life, in the brain. Now, of course, we know it was the same discussions we were arguing about and writing papers about in graduate school. But now this word trauma, it's like it's new. I said to my therapist when I was talking about I was asking them what their trauma training was, and one of my therapists, this is years ago, said, I don't have any trauma training specifically. And I said, what do you think we're treating? I mean, that's all we're treating all the time with everybody. So while trauma is a buzzword and it's new jargon these days, It's essentially it's the very first thing that the very first therapist thought of. That there was a traumatic event in one's history where symptoms and defenses were organized around that wound or that trauma to protect the person from the feeling or from it happening again. Simple as that. So it's not one or the other, it's both. We all have genetic predispositions for certain things, for certain behaviors, for resiliency to stress. All of us do. Then you introduce the environment. And if you were to look at a graph, you would see on the y-axis and the x-axis, you would see genetic predisposition, and you would see events in the environment, and you would see this relationship where the more genetic resiliency was there, the more stress somebody could tolerate. It's simple as that. It's not very complicated. Like I talked about, these are some of the stages that these were coined by the developmental psychologist Erik Erikson. Trust, autonomy, industry. That shouldn't be autonomy twice. I'm forgetting the word. Maybe Travis can tell me. Sorry about that. Identity, like I said, that's adolescence, and then intimacy, relationships. And there are more than that that have been added onto that. But depending upon when the trauma happens, occurs to us, those stages, those tasks can become arrested or delayed, or we can become fixated at never accomplishing the core tasks of that stage of development. If we're exposed to trauma over a long period of time, we can have a trauma response that's called post-traumatic stress disorder, which is wide and varied. It's, in fact, post-traumatic stress disorder is probably a diagnosis that has almost every single potential behavior in it. And I think it speaks back to that idea that trauma is at the base, at the beginning of, at the core of, underneath it all. So pervasive feelings of peer powerlessness, helplessness, dramatic fear responses. Dissociative symptoms can be a part of it. Cutting, eating disorder, substance abuse. I mean, think about these. This is just the list of things that we treat at Evoke. Dangerous, far out behavior, attachments, unable to attach in relationships, becoming oppositional, not knowing who you are, becoming a bully, mimicking the abuse, getting in relationships that are unstable through projective identification, identifying with the perpetrator is another way of describing bullying, lying, exaggerations, all of these things. That's the problem with somebody talking about the historical trauma, is they also have a often associated behaviors that make them untrustworthy. And so you think to yourself, well, how can I trust this child giving an accurate report? Because who knows if they're telling the truth, because they're lying, they're exaggerating, they're making up symptoms, they're dissociating, all of these things. But that's the tricky part of it, is that's what's present in a traumatized person. Trauma or stress causes the brain to produce neurochemicals, like I said, cortisol and endorphins, that are regulated by the hypothalamus. When creating these chemicals repeatedly over time, the brain can become addicted to them. This may be why addicts or family members in an addicted family are often drawn to drama, intensity, stress, and fear. They cause the brain to generate cortisol and endorphins. So in other words, the kind of family that we grew up with, the more chaotic, the more trauma, the more stress that there was, we can look for those same kinds of experiences and have this kind of paired attachment idea with our adult relationships. That's what family felt like. The only home I knew was unstable and unsafe. So when I find relationships that are unstable and unsafe, it feels like home, because attachment or history, attachment trumps trauma. If my attachment history, which is my childhood, if my attachment history has in it abuse, chaos, and addiction, I'm going to be drawn to relationships that have those same kind of things because that's the only attachment I know. Shame, addiction, isolation, poor reality testing, a wide variety. This is a fascinating slide here that I want to share with you. How our brain stores trauma. The brain stores memories in clusters called cell assemblies as interconnected and associated events. You know, when you're driving down the street and you smell something, or you're driving past a certain place and you remember a song, or you're listening to a song and you remember a thought, a feeling, an experience, a relationship, those are cell clusters, cell assemblies. Because of the way in which the memories are triggered by association, an experience, odor, texture, sound, or object reminiscent of any part of a memory stored in the cells of the brain can stimulate associated memories. In fact, olfactory or smell is one of the most powerful ways that we can recall memories. Because memories with a high emotional content, pleasant or unpleasant, are more easily recalled by the brain, traumatic memories have a sort of hierarchy power over other less emotionally laden ones. We don't remember lazy days. We remember the good and bad. And we even prioritize the bad over the good. This is an important idea some of you may know about. There's something called a negative bias. A negative bias is the human brain's propensity to hierarchically value negative experiences over positive ones. Our brain thinks that negative experiences are more worth remembering than positive ones. And here's the idea behind it. If I miss a rattlesnake, I could die. If I don't remember that a rattlesnake could kill me, because the last time it bit me, I almost died, I can die. That's my brain saying that's the most important thing. If I miss a sandwich or a piece of fruit hanging from a tree, I miss a meal. Miss a tiger in the grass, I'm dead. Miss a piece of low-hanging fruit, I miss a meal. So my brain is definitely going to pay more attention to the negative, which is another reason. You know how most of us would identify with the idea that we could hear 10 positive things and one negative thing, and the one negative thing would seem to stick out in our brain? That's negative bias. And the more traumatized our brain is, the more heightened that's going to be, the less safe we have felt. If you are prone to focus on things that are a threat more, if your negative bias is on high alert, you've experienced big T or chronic little t trauma. That's a little bit of a side note to this. We take in information through all five senses. Many traumas are pre-verbal experiences that occurred before we learn to express ourselves through speech. It is difficult to reach these wordless places and reflect upon them exclusively through the use of language. But when our bodies are engaged, we can move through the memory and show what happened rather than try to reconstruct it through the words. Thus, Evoke wilderness therapy. Thus, experiential therapy, intensive therapy. If we can engage more of the senses than just engaging in a verbal dialogue with our therapist, we're going to find access to our trauma more easily, more readily. We're going to come to understand our trauma responses first. I think this is probably one of the biggest awarenesses I've come to in the last couple of years, as I've had clients that have sought to kind of discover their trauma, their history. They know something's not right in their relationship or their mental health, and so they're believing that probably has some root, some connection to the history. So then they just try to go back and try to figure out what happened. But there's no overt memory that makes sense to them. What I've kind of figured out is that the way we typically discover our history is through our present day responses to things. When I was a young client in therapy, I would share with my therapist my experience in the world, in marriage, at work, with clients, with my children. And my therapist would make comments about my mother and my father. And I remember saying to her, or thinking, excuse me, I remember thinking, how can she, that's a leap she just took. How can she say that? I haven't told her enough about my mother and my father for her to know that's true. And now, 15 or 20 years later, everything she said was obvious to me. She was seeing responses, my responses to the world, to her even, maybe most importantly to her. She was seeing my responses and she was able to extrapolate what my childhood was like. I remember when my publisher said to me, how long does it take you to figure somebody out by the way that they're acting? And I said, if you pay attention and you're pretty grounded, you can see what somebody's childhood is like pretty quickly. Not too long ago, I was doing supervision with my therapist about a client. And again, same kind of thing. I was describing the way the client was reacting to me. And my therapist said to me, the client is telling you about their parents in ways that they can't articulate or remember. They can't imagine that you're going to be different from their primary attachment figures. So they're teaching you about what their childhood was like. I want you to read this next quote or listen to this next quote. I want you to listen to it in relationship to you as a child, not to your children, just for today. By Daniel Siegel and Mary Hartzell. Research suggests that children who have had a positive connection in life have a source of resilience for dealing with life's challenges. The most important mitigating factor is having one person in our life consistent who saw us, who was attuned to us. Having that person gives us a sense of self. And while we might experience big T and little t trauma, it's less likely to have more detrimental effects upon us. It'd be nice if we had two. It'd be nice if we had more. But for you single parents or you parents who are co-parenting with a parent who's not on board with the work, one person makes a difference. In fact, we saw in the research that I did during my doctoral degree, we saw a statistically significant difference if one person, if a client reported one person, we did not see a difference then if they added a second person. So when you have a positive connection with an adult, somebody consistent, trauma is mitigated. You feel safe. You go from somebody reacting, like I said, with the proverbial gasp of to what I talk about when I talk about attachment responses, which sounds like, I'm glad you're talking about it. Thanks for telling me. I want to understand. Keep talking. And most importantly, by far, it's when they're talking to you about you. That's the moment when you're really, and it's also the hardest moment, to respond to them in a non-anxious way. Again, making a case for how experiential therapy can help us recognize our trauma triggers and trace them back to our original traumas. You kind of put them together in reverse, right? You understand the theme before you remember the event. That's important. You understand the theme, the process of your history before you remember the event, because the events are invisible until you're able to filter them through this new awareness. Talk therapy is a process of helping the unconscious to become conscious. Spoken communication is invaluable, yet at the same time limited in helping us become aware of our inner life and our unconscious ways of relating to each other. Experiential therapy techniques are in action and internalizing and resolving interdevelopmental conflicts by recreating stories from our past and present circumstances and transforming them into more tolerable life experiences. We create competing experiences. So everybody watching this webinar, everybody listening to this podcast, you have trauma. You have trauma responses. Trauma is inescapable. You have it more or less. Healing trauma is elective. Therapy is a choice. Dents and bruises are not a choice. Because you're a human and you've grown up in a human world with human parents, you have trauma more or less. But healing is a choice. And so you learn about your trauma response to discover your trauma. And everybody watching or listening has trauma responses. Impatient, knee-jerk, unfiltered, non-reflective responses. Everybody, quote unquote, overreacts in a marriage, in parenting, at work. Everybody has responses that are disproportionate to the circumstances by objective measure. Of course, we get very defensive because we're so tied to the pain and the trauma that it's real to us. But you kind of follow your trauma responses like a trail of crumbs backwards to find the theme. And then when you discover the theme, then you start to see what happened to you. In the 30 years or so of therapy that I've done, I've not watched any home movies. I've not had dramatic memory recall, but I can see it now. I can see my childhood clearly. I can see those things that my therapist was describing as I was describing my reactions to friends, my spouse, and my children, my colleagues, to her. I can see them now. In a way, thinking this way, there's no such thing as an overreaction. And instead, we get curious about the reaction in ourselves. But we have to be kind to ourselves. It's why it's so imperative in this work that we find a kind, non-judgmental guide who can model for us what it means to look at us, to view us, to see us through compassionate eyes. We find safe places, which is really just safe people, safe relationships, to create competing experiences compared to those that we experienced previous in our life. That's really what therapy is you're creating competing experiences. That's why the secret to therapy is not advice or psychoeducation or tools or skills. Those can be helpful. Those are helpful in the process. But the fundamental element of therapy is the therapeutic relationship. Because you can have the smartest therapist in the world, and you all know this, but if their bedside manner or their response to you is not a good one, not a compassionate one, it doesn't work. It doesn't heal. And then if we don't, to the extent we don't resolve our trauma, we pass it on. Hopefully, we make a little progress. Hopefully, we reverse things just a little bit. Hopefully, we make a little improvement on the previous generation. And our children will do the same thing, hopefully. Anxiety and fear is a trauma response. It can be a healthy signal of a real threat also. It's not exclusively a trauma response. But chronic anxiety and fear responses to things is a trauma response. It takes years to make big improvements on response flexibility. It takes years. No one of these podcasts, webinars, not my books, not all the books that I would recommend. If you could consume them in a period of 3-4 months, you would make some gains, of course. but we're trying to rewire the brain. And the way that the brain gets rewired is through experience. Not just experiential therapy, mind you. I want to make this point because I think it's important. Not just through experiential therapy like we do at Evoke's wilderness therapy program and also at our intensive programs, but also in talk therapy. Walking into a therapist's office or a support group and telling the truth about yourself and having somebody respond with patience, curiosity, non-judgment, and compassion, that's experiential therapy. That's the experience of therapy. And it takes a long time. All you can do is get on the road, do your work. And there's no shortcut or substitute for work. And just remember, back to the idea of kindness, everybody in the sound of my voice, within the sound of my voice has a limitation. All of you do. I do. Nobody has infinite patience. So you're going to reach the end of your patience. You're going to be triggered. Every single person. And one of the skills that you can use is to take a time out, to slow it down. You can meditate. You can practice breathing. We do things in those examples, right? Meditation, breathing, taking a time out. Those are kind of hacking the nervous system. You slow down your breathing and you trick your body into calmness. You take a time out and you remove yourself from a triggering stimulus, and you give a chance for your prefrontal cortex or the higher levels of your brain to come back online. So everybody's going to be triggered. Everybody. I am all the time. I've said this many times, but at 52 years of age, which is how old I am today, right now, I am more aware of how much I screw up every day. I'm definitely more aware of my fallibilities as a father than I was 20 years ago. I thought I was pretty amazing 20 years ago. But through my work, I realized it's a constant display of buffoonery. And I'm just working at it. And lastly, I would just say that doing your work, which is just this work, listening, watching, reading, going to therapy, going to support groups, going to intensives, it's supposed to be a joy and a freedom. If it's done well, it's not a burden. If it's done well and you want to take a break from it, take a break from it. I'm going to be talking more about therapy burnout in a few weeks. Somebody asked me to talk about that, but therapy should feel good. Not painless, because we can feel feelings that we have been avoiding for sure. But it's meaningful and it's freedom. And when Sigmund Freud, that the outcome of effective therapy is freedom, and he was talking about freedom from unconscious obligations, he was talking about response flexibility. He was talking about freedom from knee-jerk, reflexive, rigid responses to stimulus. That's what he was describing. We can consciously, thoughtfully contemplate our responses to things. That's what it feels like. I say this to the therapists all the time. Yes, the students that we work with, even the parents that we work with, might be angry and frustrated for being at this point in their life. But ideally, there are moments throughout the work with them, in the therapy sessions in the field or on the parent weekly phone call. There should be moments. There will be moments where they'll feel better because you see them, because you understand them, because they're found, heard. And that everybody up to this point who's been telling them that something was wrong with them and broken with them, that melts away. That's noise. Their response in the context of trauma, all of our responses make perfect sense. All right. I'll go to questions at the end. before that, I'll do announcements. If you want to do a deep dive into your work, the intensives program is fantastic. Our staff are phenomenal at it. Wonderful attachment-based, experiential. We're doing them online now during the pandemic. We still have some in-person. If you're able to do it, we have special protocols to keep everybody safe. We're doing them in person on occasion, but we're also doing them online. I recommend both, whatever feels like the best fit. Just go to email intensives@evoketherapy.com to find out which one is right for you and when it might work for you, or go to our website. We have a Pursuits Adventure program, Think Therapy Light Adventure. Contact Sarah at evoketherapy.com for more information to ask questions about that. Upcoming parent support groups, August 6th with Dr. Matt Hoig at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And for our intensive alumni, it's August 11th, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. These offerings are only for our current and alumni families. Okay? Contact Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information. We ask all current parents to go to 6 support groups. Any combination of Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Adult Children, Refuge Recovery, or you can go to the National Alliance on Mental Illness for classes and resources that are free in your area, your local chapter. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You in Evoke Therapy Podcast, or you can find us on soundcloud.com on the computer. You can find Evoke Therapy programs on Twitter and Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy, or you can find the Intensives program on Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find both Evoke Therapy programs and Evoke Therapy Intensives. We're still looking for new board members. The board is in a period still of reorganizing. So we're looking for folks for the foundation, but the Evoke Family Foundation, you can find and learn more by going to their website or going to Facebook. And the Evoke Therapy blog, of course, is a fantastic resource with new content each week. My books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon. My audio version, using my voice, is coming out in the next couple of weeks for The Audacity to Be You. All right. Somebody says, when you talk about having reflective conversations with your children, do you mean using reflective listening? That's a part of it, but that's not what I meant. Reflective means that you're able to reflect, that you're not having a knee-jerk, reflexive response. It's so interesting, too, because we can go into a discussion thinking I'm going to be reflective and contemplative and thoughtful, and I can get triggered. So I'm talking more about your thought processes. And if you are having a reflective conversation, you are going to listen more, and you may use reflective listening. But it's more that you can be thoughtful and respond flexibly instead of in kind of knee-jerk, impulsive ways. Somebody says, regarding the Siegel and Hartzell quote, what age is the most impactful to have a positive connection? Younger. It almost is younger to older. But it's also different. And it's never too late. That's really important. Younger is better. Younger has has broad application and broad impact. But I promise you, folks, it's never too late. Treatment for your family during your child's adolescence and young adulthood is not too late. And I'm not just placating you. It makes a difference. It makes a difference in adulthood. It's never too late to get into your work and to show up differently for your children. It's never too late to unpack and heal your trauma, to look at your own family of origin critically, and thus being able to provide your child with something more intentional. It's never too late. And according to the stage-like understanding of trauma, it's different kinds of impacts at different times, but younger is important because of its small environment, so to speak, with broad applications. If the world is untrusting because you were not taken care of in the early phases of life, that's a hard one to repair. It can still be repaired, but it's difficult and it's broad. Someone says, do certain learning disabilities or developmental disorders make access to the higher resources more difficult? What about substance abuse? Yes and yes, absolutely. Poor executive functioning, nonverbal learning disabilities, Autism spectrum disorder? Absolutely. It's why it's so important at Evoke with Sanford Shapiro being brought on as a learning specialist for us to be very, I was just saying this to a group of parents this morning. You know, I think this is conservative. But what if 20% of our prison population, what if we found at the root of their issues? Because there's a strong correlation between learning disabilities and antisocial behavior. A really, really strong relationship. What if 20% of our prison inmates in America, which is a lot of people, what if those issues could be traced back to undiagnosed or unrecognized learning disabilities? Think about how tragic that is. So yes, we want to understand children's cognitive processing issues, their verbal abilities, their ability to make meaning out of metaphor, right? To listen to auditory information, all of it and that's why at Evoke we try to have more than one way to do every assignment. We want to have several ways to do every assignment. That's why we try to meet you where you're at during our intensive program. All of our staff are incredibly trained at shifting and becoming flexible, not getting tied into one way of doing it. Absolutely. And then, of course, substance abuse is going to cloud, of course. It is a symptom of trauma, and it's the cause of more trauma, right? It makes things worse. And in one way, it makes them better because the pain goes away temporarily. Any more questions, Malia? Looks like there are no more. All right, folks, I'm going to do a question and answer. You're welcome to come with any questions, any follow-up, any question on any topic. Tuesday, August 4th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Tuesday, August 4th, a week from today at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. You can invite family and friends. Please share this with anybody in your extended network so that if they have questions and they want to talk to the program directly, happy to speak on any topics. You can pre-submit questions or you can show up with questions about them, for them. Siblings can come. Siblings are invited, grandparents, aunts, uncles, close family, friends, anybody that you want to kind of pass the burden off to me of answering a lot of the questions that they might have for Evoke. Feel free to invite them and send them the link to this. All right, folks, have a great evening. Thank you for coming. I hope this was helpful, and I'll talk to you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.